Support comes from Mosby Building Arts. This year, put your trust in Mosby Building Arts for fresh designs and the elevated remodeling experience you deserve. Inspiration at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. When Megan Green became St. Louis Board of Aldermen President in 2022, she said reforming tax incentives for development was one of her top priorities. In decades past, the city used incentives in the form of tax increment financing districts and abatements to entice developers to build projects in the city. But critics say the way the city doled them out in the past was haphazard and cost the city and taxing districts money that could otherwise have gone toward benefiting public schools and other services. In a moment, we'll talk with St. Louis Public Radio economic development reporter Kavahn Mansouri about the big picture when it comes to tax incentives. But first, let's listen to Kavahn's conversation with Megan Green. Kavahn first asked Green why economic incentives have been a big focus and passion during her tenure.
As somebody who worked in education for a long time, I have my PhD in education policy. You really can't talk about economic development without talking about its impact on schools. And so for me, that's always been one of the driving forces, is to make sure that we're very intentional with our use of tax incentives, because we need as much revenue going into our public schools as possible. I think the other piece of that is to make sure that we're not over incentivizing projects, because beyond our public schools, our city coffers rely on tax revenue from new development. And if we're constantly, giving out tax incentives that last for 10, 15, 20 years, and then that they expire, and then, inevitably there's then another request to re-up it, we never end up realizing that actual, economic activity for the city.
And can you talk a little bit about the history of that? And sort of, I know that early 2000s, the city, if you look at sort of the scale of things, they went a little incentive crazy. But then in recent years, things have kind of crawled to sort of a halt. Can you kind of talk about how we got to where we're at now?
Sure. When I first moved to St. Louis in 2005, I was actually a Coro Fellow, and it was the first time that I had actually learned about tax incentives. And it was kind of at the height of that frenzy of use of tax incentives. And there was this kind of mythos out there at the moment that said, in 10 years, the city is just going to be so rich because all of these, abatements are going to, run out, and then we're going to have all this money. Well, then that 10 years came and that didn't happen. And then there had been a number of subsequent, follow-up reports that actually showed that quite a bit of the development that was subsidized would have happened regardless, and that it didn't really move the needle for our city. What was also eye-opening to me is when I first got to the Board of Aldermen, there were literally no standards for development. We did not have fiscal notes, and so we didn't actually know the fiscal impact of anything we were passing. There was no evaluation of projects to know that, hey, there's community demand for this, community support for this makes sense to subsidize. And it was a battle over, a number of years to get fiscal notes in place, to get some standards in place, to get some evaluation in place. And then, that really culminated a couple years ago in the SLDC creating the Economic Justice Scorecard and Community Benefit Scorecard. Because what that told us is now we're setting out a standard of what we want development to look like in this city, and tailoring the amount of incentive that a development gets on its ability to meet the criteria that what we want to see for development in our city. So instead of this blanket, you get whatever you come and ask for, there's actually some standards so that the city is more proactive in stating what our intentions are around development, rather than being completely a developer-led process.
I want to come back to the economic scorecard because I find that really interesting. But I also wanted to talk to you a bit about this idea that there's not a lot of now there's more. But actually, when I first joined, I talked with one of your policy advisors. We got coffee, and we talked about how there's a lack of data in the city to really understand what we're doing and where we're headed. Is that still sort of a frustration for you?
It is, because I'm obviously somebody that comes from a research background. I love data, and that's how you should be making decisions. And oftentimes, even after a project gets approved and it gets built, we don't really go back and track to see, did it actually meet what it said it was going to in its filings with the city? Did it generate the amount of tax revenue? We know for our TIFs, because we're required on an annual basis to pass legislation that basically kind of re-ups, not necessarily re-ups, but shows the progress of those TIFs are making satisfactory progress. But what we've seen is they actually haven't been making satisfactory progress. And so a lot of the financial estimates that are often presented to the city don't always end up to become true in the end. But I think that type of analysis detail really needs to be done on tax abatements as well.
Yeah, because sometimes, I think we saw this with, and I was going to ask you about this later, but I think we saw this with some recent SLDC headlines where it's like some of the data that is presented is a little bit based on opinion, or it could be perspective based, I guess.
I mean, it was frustrating to see some of those headlines, because it was definitely trying to create this, I think, narrative that, the city cut down on incentives and now it's all doom and gloom for development, which actually was not true. And we have not found a significant pullback in development, even though we cut the amount of incentives that we've offered over the last 4 years, basically in half. And I think that's really important for the public to know, because, again, there had been this mythos for a long time that unless we completely subsidize everything to the maximum amount, nobody's ever going to come and develop in our city. And I think at the end of the day, what developers are really looking for is standards and what the rules of the game are. And if we can create those standardized rules that aren't just call up the director of SLDC and say, hey, I want this, and they're like, sure, dude, here you go, then we end up in a better place as a city. And another point that I think is really important is the fact that we cut down on development incentives at a time when we also had record high inflation, where we had record high, interest rates or interest rates that were much higher than we've seen in many, many decades, and still did not see a significant drop in development in our city, I think shows that we're on the right track.
What more would you like to see? The city does take a much more nuanced stance on incentives now. What more would you like to see going forward?
I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, especially when we look at standardizing development. For example, you look at downtown at the moment. Probably the biggest issue with downtown is the same issue we have with our region, and that's fragmentation. We have so many different, tax incentives that have been issued to different buildings. We have, dozens of special taxing districts, 2 different kind of competing SIDs, multiple civic organizations. And so there's no unified vision or direction to say, hey, if I'm a developer who wants to, invest in downtown, I know that if I go down there, I will get XYZ if I do, this type of project. If I do a project that's, converting office to residential, or that's, creating housing that has a certain amount of affordability into it, or if I'm a new business that is relocating into the city and wants to go downtown. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to kind of even focus our scorecard a little bit more in certain areas of the city to make it clear that this is the type of incentive that you would qualify for if you make certain criteria based upon the type of development we want to see in those areas.
And do you feel that adding those sort of things, that would be something that the rest of the board would support, and that you think you could get through? I
do. And we've had preliminary conversations with some members of the board around this. And I think, overall, is a recognition that we need to maybe pull back a little bit and start thinking bigger picture. And so instead of having, project by project kind of goals and saying, like, it's great the Millennium's getting redeveloped, it's great the AT&T's building's getting redeveloped, let's figure out comprehensive plans for what we actually want certain areas to look like. And I think this is particularly true as we look at tornado recovery too. It has to be community led, but we also know that there aren't markets that exist in the north side the way that there are in other areas of the city. And so there will have to be a high level of incentive that's given in order to get certain developers to want to come and help rebuild in a lot of the tornado damaged areas. But I think one of the ways we do that is by setting out a blueprint of, hey, this is the type of development we're looking for, and this is the type of incentives that you get if you do this type of development.
How far off do you think we are from something like that for the parts of North City that were impacted by the tornado?
I think we're still pretty far away from that. I think we're at a part where we still don't even have a true understanding of what the costs are. And I think until we have a true understanding of what the damage is, what the costs are, it's really hard to create that full blueprint. And, I've been very frustrated with the slow pace of recovery. We're going on 9 months now post-recovery, and it does not look any different. And in some cases looks a lot worse than it did the day after the tornado. And so we've got to speed up that recovery, but we also need data coming in so that we can actually make some good informed decisions to design that framework for how we rebuild.
Going forward, what do you see in the immediate future on economic incentives? Obviously, we just had this kind of another report from Good Jobs First, highly contested report, I would say. I think that's one of the stories I've got the most emails from saying, agreeing with or saying that report is ridiculous. But they make the claim that the school districts are really suffering from the incentives that were given out. I mean, gosh, we're thinking very long now. Mm-hmm. But what are your thoughts on that, and what do you kind of see in the immediate future?
I mean, I look at a report like that, and I look at the creation of the Economic Justice Scorecard and the fact that we have been much more intentional in our use of incentives over the last 4 years, and I can say that we're moving in the right direction. And it will take 10, 15 years before some of those other previously issued tax incentives will finally roll off the books, but we're heading in the right direction. And I think we need to continue down that path and set an example for what responsible development looks like. Because I think too often in the past, we've gotten stuck in this binary of it's either, development or the schools. Well, we can do both. And, and we've shown through some projects this past year that we can negotiate projects with the school district that provide them benefits. So, we look at the, Midas hotels, and we were able to create a relationship between them and the school district so that they would provide a certain number of hotel rooms for unhoused families. And so there's ways to make sure that development actually works for community, and that entities that stand to, forego tax revenue like the school district have a role in this and have a relationship with the developers and are able to, work out something that kind of works for everyone.
Yeah, I do notice sometimes when it comes to these sort of things, it feels like the school district is missing from the table sometimes. Is that a relationship that you hope is sort of repaired?
Yes. I mean, we've been working to make sure that the school district is more at the table. We did pass legislation probably a year and a half ago now that requires when a development proposal is submitted to SLDC that SLDC has to notify the school district because what we were finding is a lot of times they didn't know that a project even existed until it made it to the Board of Aldermen and there was a hearing on it and it made the news. And at that point in time, it's kind of too late to have your voice in the conversation. And so it's been trying to encourage SLDC to bring the school district in on the front side. The TIF commission has 2 members of the school board that sits on it, but LCRA, which oversees tax abatements and things like that, does not. And so I think there's also ways to improve that by, maybe getting a school board appointee onto some of these development boards so that there is a voice at the table that's representing the school district.
I remember months ago we talked about this, but with the sort of just like development as a whole being a little more transparent, or do you still feel like there needs to be, some of the, some of the meetings, you won't see an agenda until like maybe an hour before, and it's kind of hard just to like follow development. Do you still feel like that needs to be kind of lifted up a little bit?
I do. I mean, we still get complaints about, for SLDC, some of the agendas being posted late or not being able to testify when, in person, if you have you want to say something about a development. And so I think that there are still some improvements that could be done within the organization to perhaps model our processes at the Board of Aldermen a little bit more. Because, again, by the time it gets to the Board of Aldermen, there's been a whole lot of negotiation that's already gone into this. And so how do we figure out how we get community voice into it at an earlier pace so that there's, more input there, and then we don't get to the Board of Aldermen and we're suddenly, trying to completely redo something if there's a lot of community pushback.
Yeah. Just before we wrap up, could you just kind of run us through what the possible additions and codifying of the economic scorecard will look like when and if it passes?
So it's pretty similar to what we've been using in place. There is, I think, an added category for environmental impact, which was not something that initially was in the scorecard. But other than that, it's pretty similar to what we've had in place for about the last year and a half. But I think it's important for us to codify it. So regardless of who, leads SLDC, we have committed ourselves to this type of work. And if it's going to be changed in any kind of substantial way, then you would have to go back through a public process through the Board of Aldermen to change it. So I'm looking forward to getting that in place where, we're looking at a couple of other, changes that I think are important for us to, lift up as well. One is, creating a sunset on tax incentives. If, sometimes things get issued and then nothing happens. The development doesn't come through. But then the tax incentive gets activated for a completely different project, 10 or 15 years later. And I think if that's the case, it needs to come back through the Board of Aldermen in a public process for reauthorization before that can move forward. And so I think that's something that we want to see as well as, if there is a significant change to a development proposal. Under state law, when there is a significant change, it really is supposed to come through the Board of Aldermen again. But what we've seen historically is that hasn't happened because what a significant change is hasn't been well defined. And, a lot of this is about transparency. Even if the development ends up, ultimately getting approved in its, new form, there still needs to be a public process behind it rather than residents learning through the media that, this development changed from office to residential or to industrial or whatever without any kind of public input.
Yeah. Kind of like there were some concerns about the Armory with that, where it's like if they hadn't made like a little decision about they wanted to build residentials there, they could just kind of made a data center without really any problems.
Yeah, I mean, we heard that as a resident concern with Armory. We heard it with ICL as well, and it's really about just transparency and including the public in the process as we go along. Because, at the end of the day, the buck stops with the Board of Aldermen on these things. And so, every time residents see, something's been changed and it hasn't gone through the board, most assume that it has gone through the board. And so we carry the brunt of that regardless. And so I'd rather the board be in a position where we're actually taking in that public input, have ability to, ask questions and advocate for our communities, rather than something just happening without that public involvement.
That was St. Louis Board of Aldermen President Megan Green talking with STLPR Economic Development reporter Kavahn Mansouri. And Kavahn joins me now to talk about that conversation and the bigger picture of economic development. Welcome back to the show, Kavahn.
Thanks for having me again.
So, Kavahn, what was your overall takeaway from your conversation with Megan Green?
I would say my takeaway would be that Megan Green feels like the city's made pretty good strides towards, reforming the way it approaches economic incentives for these developments, but that there's a lot more work to do, basically. That there have been some good examples out there of times when the economic scorecard, which you heard a little bit about, has been used. But there have been other times where it has been, not quite as effective as she'd like, and I think she seems to think that a lot of the members of the Board of Aldermen agree with her as well. I think we talked a little bit about how some of the conflicting sort of pathways the city is heading in, where, for instance, Megan Green feels like there should be more reform, but sometimes at SLDC you hear like a different sort of message from the heads over there, like, maybe we need more incentives to attract development. So I think the overall takeaway is there's more work to be done, but she feels like there's been good progress.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of that economic scorecard, Kavahn, what is that specifically, and how does it factor into development?
Yeah, the economic scorecard, I believe the full name is the Economic Justice Scorecard, came into play during Mayor Tashwara Jones' administration. The former SLDC head, Neil Richardson, who departed when current Mayor Kara Spencer became mayor. Basically, it was put into, it was passed by the Board of Aldermen, and it was basically a way for projects to kind of go under the scope of this economic scorecard. And it takes into account a lot of things when, talking about handing out incentives. There are 3 different tiers. It takes into account things like, is it a minority or women-owned business that is going to be doing this development? Where geographically will it be located in St. Louis? And how much is what is the need there? How many jobs might it create? Things of that nature. And it kind of all culminates into a score that will basically tell SLDC, the St. Louis Development Corporation, which is like the city's development arm, how if it meets the standards for earning incentives, like a tax incremental district, incremental financing district, or tax abatements, which is something the city has been using a lot in the past few years, or if it isn't quite up to standards and they shouldn't offer that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it basically is something that the SLDC has been using a lot of, and the hope, as you heard, is to codify that and make it something that is always used going down the road.
And with this mention of SLDC, Green said whoever might lead that agency, so is a change in leadership coming to the St. Louis Development Corporation?
That's right. The current director, Williams, is a interim director. He is put into place after Neil Richardson left the agency, and they are currently holding searches. I think almost every week they're having a meeting talking about who might be the next one. They're all closed meetings, so we don't know much, but we're probably know something soon. I've talked to Otis about this before, and I've actually asked him because he is actually very passionate about pushing St. Louis Development Corporation and St. Louis Development in the right direction. And I asked him, you're very passionate about this for someone who's not going to be in the job very long, but he feels that it's really important to get, I think he used the phrase like St. Louis back to work or back in business. But yes, you can expect probably in the next few months to hear some sort of announcement on that, but no, we don't know much right now.
And how important, Kavahn, is that job? and what it means to the city's future?
I think it's huge. It really is huge because, SLDC really sort of is the spearhead for development, not only for, deciding who's going to get these tax incentives. The Board of Aldermen has some ways to do that as well, but they sort of lead, they lead not only interfacing with possible developers, but also trying to bring them in. A big part of their job is to try to attract developers into St. Louis to develop places like, for instance, the Railway Exchange building downtown. They own. They're hopeful that they can take that land that they got through eminent domain and get someone to purchase it and make it something new in downtown, not just sort of this dilapidated building. They're currently in negotiations to buy some of the old, falling apart school buildings that SLPS owns. They want to buy those off the schools. They want to bring in developers, turn that into housing. So it's a big deal because whoever heads that agency is sort of the mouthpiece and making a lot of decisions, or at least sort of overseeing a lot of the boards that make decisions about what sort of development might be coming to St. Louis, what sort of incentives they might get, and a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm. During your conversation, briefly, Megan Green said that there'd be no fiscal notes about the economic impact of projects that the Board of Aldermen would consider. So it seems a little hard to believe, but is that really the way that local governments operate?
So that's changed. That has changed. I believe when Megan Green came into office as the Board of Aldermen, that was true, that it was hard to know what the financial impact of these things were. There was kind of this hope, we'll see what happens and hopefully we'll be able to tell. But I believe now, I think it was an ordinance passed a while back now that there are fiscal notes. It is it is a little interesting, but I think it's not uncommon. I couldn't say for sure, but I don't think it's incredibly uncommon for that not to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Kavahn Mansouri is STLPR's economic development reporter. Kavahn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode was produced by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.